and welcome to Pearced Off, the counter-apologetics segment from Jonathan M.S. Pearce for the Skepticule Podcast. This week I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of biblical matters regarding Jesus and feeding into discussions about whether Jesus was mythical or not, or more accurately for me is this idea that if Jesus was historical, the overlays and theological and symbolic claims attached to Jesus mean that the Jesus we learn of in the Bible is so far removed from the real Jesus as to be synonymous with being mythical. So I'm going to talk about the simple fact that Jesus' tomb was not venerated. It's incredibly suspect that the place of the greatest spiritual and religious significance in the whole world seems not to have been venerated, at least not until the 4th century CE onwards. This then prompts some questions. Firstly, 1, was Jesus actually buried in a tomb? 2, was the position of the tomb unknown? And these sorts of questions then lead on to others such as 3, did the death of Jesus actually happen as reported? And 4, did the resurrection even take place? So let's look at the veneration of the tomb, or the lack thereof. And by veneration, I mean the worship or religious and spiritual respect given to dead people or places deemed as important to the religion or cult. So in Catholic traditions, veneration of saints has been a long-held tradition. Places like Lourdes garner particular reactions from Christians, and stories involving the spiritual powers and importance of such places abound. And what we need to do is look at Judaism, since this is the bedrock upon which Christianity is built. Now, there are currently records of Jewish veneration of tombs, such as Joseph's tomb, dating back to around the 5th century CE, and Rachel's tomb to the 4th century CE. Thus, if such traditions did not pre-exist Christianity, then it was the Christians who brought veneration into the spiritual spotlight. However, Raymond Brown, Catholic exegete, notes, quote, there was in this period an increasing Jewish veneration of the tombs of the martyrs and prophets, end quote. To which William Lane Craig himself adds, quote, during Jesus' time there was an extraordinary interest in the graves of Jewish martyrs and holy men, and these were scrupulously cared for and honoured, end quote. As Jesus himself says in castigating the Pharisees in Matthew 23, quote, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, end quote. And Nicholas Delange agrees, quoting, of the many Jewish shrines in the Middle East, some of which were undoubtedly of very great antiquity, the most famous were traditionally the supposed tombs of the prophet Ezekiel at El Kefil and of Ezra the scribe at Kurna, both in Babylonia, modern Iraq, end quote. Furthermore, Jews have always seemed to venerate ancient scrolls of the Torah and buildings such as a temple, so they're very used to venerating things, people and places. So I think we can successfully conclude that Jews did venerate sites and even artifacts. Would it then seem likely that early Jewish Christians would give the tomb of Jesus any such veneration? Well, absolutely. Remember, this is probably the greatest site of spiritual interest in the world, bar none. This is where God, incarnate in man and dying nearby, was given life again to rise into heaven magnificently in order to pay for our sins and give us hope. It also acts as the birthplace, if you like, for the entire Christian religion. It would be insane to think that this site would not be venerated and given special accord. So let us ask whether the site would be known and remembered. The tomb was that of Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin. Even if one didn't know exactly where this tomb was, one could surely find out. His description within the New Testament hints at him being of some notoriety, an honoured member, an honourable, rich member of the Sanhedrin. So moreover, there are a number of people who visited the tomb who clearly had to have been in some way the sources of the resurrection accounts. Whether it was Mary, the other Mary, Salome, or Simon Peter, we have a number of candidates who qualify for having such geographical knowledge. It would be strange if they could recount all the details of the resurrection to their fellow apostles and disciples, and yet somehow forget where it took place. Now, this is almost a moot point, since in describing the visitors to the tomb, it is clearly implicit that they knew where it was. So if they knew where it was, and if they were culturally and spiritually highly likely to venerate the spot, why didn't they? Let's look at briefly at reasons why they would not want to do so. So this would be the sort of Christian responses. Now, the only real reason one can posit that they would not venerate a site is out of fear for their own safety. The Sanhedrin had already perhaps placed a guard through worrying about such a site, although that is highly a contentious issue due to the fact that it seems to be an ad hoc rationalization in Matthew, answering claims from Jewish sort of thinkers and clerics that this thing couldn't have happened, and how could a body could have gone missing in such and such a way. So Matthew then answers this by placing guards at the tomb. So they had sentenced this man-god to death, and venerating such a tomb might get one into trouble. So this is again a somewhat moot point, since the early Christians show later disregard for their own safety, dying apparently with relative ease for their beliefs. And such veneration, of course, would not have to be public either. A secret pilgrimage of one or two local Christians would be well understood. And yet we have nothing, not a single word about the tomb after the resurrection had taken place. As the Christian movement grew and gained credence, any such knowledge kept within the early communities of the site of the tomb would certainly have resulted in later veneration of the site, but nothing ensued. Other reasons have been given by Christians, but they get Christian thinkers into trouble, really. For example, as Byron McCain states, quote, "The shame of Jesus' burial is not only consistent with the best evidence, but can also help to account for an historical fact which has long been puzzling to historians of early Christianity. Why did the primitive church not venerate the tomb of Jesus? Joachim Jeremias, for one, thought it inconceivable that the primitive community would have let the grave of Jesus sink into oblivion." End quote. So this is all about the shame of a dishonourable burial, as McCain espouses. Not only contradicts the Gospel accounts, and I think he's right here, because the Gospel accounts claim an honourable burial through Joseph of Arimathea, but that would never have been accorded to a criminal such as Jesus in the context. So I think McCain is right. However, this does go against what Christians believe, and it would not stop the followers anyway from venerating the tomb unless it was just completely unknown. Thus, the resurrection accounts themselves would be deemed as false under this theory of McCain. It certainly fits a good critical analysis from non-theists such as myself, but it hardly does a theist any favours. As James Dunn offers in The Evidence for Jesus, the Impact of Scholarship on Our Understanding of How Christianity Began, page 67 to 68. Sorry, I haven't added the references, all the other quotes I've used. But, quote, "Christians today, of course, regard the site of Jesus' tomb with similar veneration, and that practice goes back at least to the 4th century. But for the period covered by the New Testament and other earliest Christian writings, there is no evidence whatsoever for Christians regarding the place where Jesus had been buried as having any special significance. No practice of tomb veneration or even the meeting for worship at Jesus' tomb is attested for the first Christians. Had such been the practice of the first Christians, with all the significance which the very practice itself presupposes, it's hard to believe that our records of Jerusalem Christianity and of Christian visits there too would not have mentioned or alluded to it in some way or at some point." End quote. So, this is showing that this is a problem for Dunn. He goes on to reason that this lack of veneration in the early church was because there was no bones in the tomb, which is just simply nonsense. That's not a reason not to venerate the tomb. There are plenty of places venerated. In fact, most places around the world are venerated without bones. So the only real conclusion one can draw is that the early Christians simply did not know where the site of the tomb was. Where does this leave us? I mean, this is what I really want the point to be made here is, where does this leave us? Well, one of the following conclusions must follow. 1, the later gospel writers made up such claims, and thus the place did not really exist, and the resurrection accounts should be wholly doubted as accurate. 2, Jesus did die, but he was actually buried in an unknown grave, a shallow grave, as is accustomed for a dishonourable burial, and this calls into question the historicity of those resurrection accounts. And number 3, Jesus simply did not exist. It's similar to 1, but the whole gamut of the gospel claims is false. Any other ad hoc Christian rationalization is simply not good enough. It doesn't do the job it needs to do. It doesn't answer the question well enough. And the question, why was the tomb of Jesus, God incarnate, not venerated? It's an important question, and I think Christians don't do enough to answer it properly. And it leads us to the conclusion that the resurrection accounts are simply not historical enough. Thank you. I've been Jonathan M.S. Pearce, and as ever, question everything, drop by my blog